So, this week we're starting James chapter 2, and we're talking about favoritism today. And we've been looking at, obviously all of chapter 1, almost all we've had is continual, just this onslaught of what I keep calling 101 ways to know if your relationship, your walk, or if your faith is genuine, or if you're really just a very fake individual who's just an exterior shell of what you should be in your Christianity. It's just over and over ways to examine yourself to see if you're true. And I think really at the core of all this always is going to be your heart. It's always going to be, who are you on the inside? Are you someone who has the care of Jesus Christ within your heart? So at the end of chapter 1, we kind of ended off with this true and false religion. You know, anyone who thinks he is religious and does not bridle his tongue but deceives his heart, this person's religion is worthless. And then he goes on to true religion. He says those who visit widows and orphans in their affliction, he says this is religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father. It's just over and over like, this is how you know, this is how you know. And I hope as we're going through this, you're building just layers of being like, yeah, I can look back and I can be like, these are all the things that I'm going to look for. I'm going to watch my tongue. I'm going to watch who I care about. I'm going to watch just all of these things, the things that I pursue in this world. I'm going to be watching all of these things so I can know what it is to live a walk of faith, a life of faith, and what it really is to be somebody who lives by faith. So here, as we're starting chapter 2, it starts off like this. He says, "My brothers, show no partiality as you hold the faith in our Lord Jesus Christ, the Lord of glory." And, you know, he's like, as you hold the faith, and I think of it as like holding the line, or like as you carry the flag, as you press on, as people may try to push you off this walk of faith. He's like, as you're holding on to the faith, as you're walking the faith, as you're following this road and pressing forward and moving on, he's like, as you're holding the faith, he says, don't be like someone who shows partiality. This is a big part of, this is something that James spends a lot of time on. How do you view people? And this is something he spends quite a bit of time on. He's like, Christianity has a bigger circle than just my best friends. Christianity, over and over, sees people out there through the eyes of Jesus. That they would see people, that they wouldn't be partial in choosing one person over another, that they wouldn't live like that. And he's like, as you hold the faith, this is important. As you live the life that really Christianity is about, this is important. And back to World's Best Dog. I don't know why, but I just keep coming up with this stuff. Dog keeps providing it. Anyway, but Claire asked me, she's like, what you preaching on? I was like, favoritism. She's like, you're preaching on favoritism? she's like, you know, I'm the wife who just stands here, you know, like a statue, and you're like, oh, there's my baby, you know, and then there's Lucy, the world's best dog. Come here, world's best dog. Oh, and she's like, I remember when you used to love me like that. I remember when I used to be the world's best dog. Yeah, not the world's best dog, but, you know, I remember when I used to get that kind of attention, and now I'm just like the mom who stands here while you're just all doting over this little world's best. Yeah, and then so she came up with another one too. She's like, you know, we're going through the book of James, and she's like, the book of James is about testing based on evidence, right? Right? You get where it's going, right? She's like, I think the world's best dog, we need to quit assuming what she is and start looking at it based on actions, you know? So we let the world's best dog in, like, 3 days ago or something? So world's best dog comes in, hasn't been in a little while, and once again, she's had all this time outside to do what she needs to do, right? So we let the world's best dog in, she's running around the house, she jumps up on the chair, my wife's like, what's she doing up on the chair, you know? And like, it just takes no time at all. Like, this is gross, okay? But she like horks up something disgusting. It's and it's just like this pile of like, I wouldn't have thought she could have gotten this down. It was something awful, and it was big and nasty, and she horks it up on our chair. And I just think, you know, world's best dog maybe needs to look at, you know, maybe a little bit of testing or a little bit of evidence of being the world's best dog. And all that came back to favoritism, you know. That's where it was coming. So we're looking at testing ourselves to see if we are what we are supposed to be, if we're holding the faith, if we're holding the line, if we're actually the world's best person, as Craig alluded to earlier. And so as we're looking at this, James today is highlighting a life of favoritism. If this is going to bode poorly against a life of carrying on the faith, if you have favoritism. And he says this in verse 2. He says, if a man wearing a gold ring and fine clothing walks into your assembly, and he says, and so does a poor man in shabby clothing. And he says, and if you pay attention to the man in fine clothing, and you say, come sit over here in a good place, well, you say to the poor man, go sit over there, or sit down at my feet. And he says, when we are looking at our friends, and if we're looking at people, they're coming into our congregation, you may say, oh, I'm not a person who shows favoritism. I don't have favoritism to certain people, but I'm telling you, there's a simple truth that people who are needy and suffering and maybe they're poor, they're not as easy to deal with. They are more work. You have friends who have things, you're like, well, we're going to meet up. They'll drive. You have friends who don't have something, you drive, and you have some relationships and you're like, man, I'm always pouring myself into this, and what do I ever get back from it? It is a common, natural thing that I think James is really going to point out. We don't always realize we're showing favoritism. We may think, oh, we're just friends with these people, but do we spend the bulk of our time with people that there's something in it for us? That we gravitate to people who actually provide us with well, I like being friends with this person because this is a good friend for me because there's all this benefits of being friends with this person, so I just naturally gravitate towards them, and I don't realize that I'm shunning other people. It just doesn't cross my mind. And I think of what Jesus says. Jesus says this in Luke 14:12. Jesus was invited to a banquet. And he says this, he said to the man who invited him, he says, when you give a feast or a banquet, he says, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or your rich neighbors. He says, unless they invite you in return and you be repaid. But he says, when you give a banquet, he says, invite the poor and the crippled and the lame and the blind who cannot repay you. And he says, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the just. He says, when you are trying to show hospitality, a lot of us think, oh, I'm this hospitable person. I have my friends over a lot. I'm always reaching out to my friends and my relatives and my rich neighbors. But there's a big difference. Because to show Christianity, to show what it is to actually be holding the faith, you're going to be reaching out to the people who are suffering and hurting and poor and outside. Maybe these people who don't really have friends. These people who are feeling like maybe there isn't someone who cares about me here in this church. Maybe someone who comes into this church and you're like, oh, I'm very friendly to all of these people. But he says when someone comes into your congregation, who do you gravitate towards? Who are you sharing your love towards? Who are you being a friend to? Because there's a lot of people who need a friend, but they're not the easiest people to gravitate towards. It's pretty common nature that we gravitate towards the people who are the most easy and that there's something in the friendship for us. But we're not really looking in a loving way like Jesus would look and gravitate towards. We're not really doing that all the time. It takes the right mindset and the right heart, I'll say that, to go to the people. So if I visit you in church, I'm assuming you're just this real rugrat. No, I'm just kidding. No, don't assume that. But we need to purpose to visit people who need that, who, we're saying, what can I be to them? I'm going over there not because I think, this is something for me, but I'm going to them because I want to be a friend to them. I'm thinking, how can I reach out and share love to those people? So as we look at this, I think of, even this, as James says, holding the faith, that this is part of living the life of faith. I think of what Jesus says in Matthew 5:46. He says, if you love only those who love you, he says, what more are you doing than others? He says, do not even the tax collectors do the same? He says, if you love people who love you, and he says, you're like, I'm hospitable and I'm friendly and I'm always reaching out. He says, but wait a minute. There's a difference between Christianity and non-Christianity. He says the most disgusting people on earth are very friendly and hospitable, but do you see the people outside of your easy circle of visiting? And do you go to those people who need a friend, or do you go to your friends to be friends. And then Jesus says again in the next verse in 547, he says, if you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? He says, do not even the pagans do the same? He says, when you're being friendly and hospitable and kind and a friend, and you're like, who in this church do I reach out to? In this community do I reach out to? And who do I choose to be a friends with? He says, who are you choosing? Because if your best friends and the people that you love hanging out with are people that are fun to hang out with, they have things that are fun and to enjoy, maybe you get to go to their house and it's just good time, or maybe you have all of these things that go with who you visit, but there's a difference. He says, listen, pagans do that. People who don't have God do that. If you're holding the faith, obviously there's something more that you're like, wait a minute, this person needs a friend, and this person obviously is probably suffering, and I should go to them and be like, hey, how can I be something to you? And this, once again, it always shows what's deeper in the heart of man. It's like, it's more than that surface, because everybody has that surface level of friendship and hospitality and that, but holding the faith, that's going to that person who probably doesn't have as many friends as the rest of people in that room, right? It's going to that person and being like, you know what? I care about you, And so it's very important that we recognize that Christianity has a larger circle of friends, that it's everyone, that you're reaching out to them. And then James says this, and this is really a kind of a knife to the heart a little bit. James says this in verse 4. He says, when you're choosing like this, he says, have you not made a distinction among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? And we may say, I did nothing wrong. I walked up and I was friendly to somebody who was pretty cool. Did I sin? James says, no, wait a minute. Examine yourself. Were you not a judge of who was more worthy of your friendship? Did you not make a distinction and say this person is lower than that person? And that maybe this person who's really maybe a little more grubby is a lesser person? He says, did you not become a judge of people with evil in your heart? And you're like, I just was a friend to somebody who was cool and friends, like they had all these cool guns and stuff or whatever, like great to talk to. Did I do something wrong? But how often do we not realize that somebody else who does not have friends in that area, in that room, in that community, felt like they were all alone? We don't realize it. James is like, you gotta think. You gotta think. You don't think you did something wrong because you thought you were friendly. You were friendly. But Christianity goes beyond that. Christianity looks, once again, just like Jesus Christ, looks with the eyes to the heart to say, who do I care about that is different than the unsaved? Christianity goes further with these things. And I think of, what he says here in verse 5, he says, my beloved brothers, has God not chosen what is poor in the world to be rich in faith? And he says, and heirs of the kingdom that he has promised to those who love him. He says, think about this. Who are God's people in that room, in that community? He says, has God not chosen those who are poor to be rich in faith? He says, do you realize that God, many times, these are his precious children? These people who are maybe a little bit more outcast that you would maybe consider, they don't have all these things and money and they're not on this great grand course in life. He says, do you realize who do you think are God's people in that congregation? Who do you think that God has chosen to be rich in faith? He says, many times those who are hurting are the ones who are truly calling out to God, that they're rich and ingrained deep in faith. And he says, you're choosing the wrong friends, you're choosing the wrong people in all of this. And then he says here in I want to look at what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 1:26. He says, and this I think goes right along with this. He says, consider your calling, brothers. He says, not many of you were wise according to worldly standards. He says, not many of you were powerful. He says, not many of you were noble birth. And he says, but God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. And God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. He says that God chose people who you may not think are special to really stomp out, like in this perfect form of justice. God chooses these people that everybody thinks are nothing to be rich in faith, to put all of these arrogant people who think they're so great in this world to shame. You know? So when you're choosing your friends, and you're choosing your culture, and you're buddying up to all of these people, he says, you may be buddying up to the exact wrong crowd. You're really shunning the crowd that would be rich in faith. The people who would be calling out to God, those are the people that you're really shunning to go to the people who are chasing the world's things. You're really choosing, by default, the wrong crowd. And then he says this, he says, God shows what is foolish in the world to shame the strong, and God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. And he says, God chose what is lowly and despised to bring to nothing the things that seem to be something. God's like, I want to choose these people who may seem like they're outcasts, to be people who are my people, who are rich in faith, that I show them in order to show people who think they're all of that in a bag of chips, that in my perfect justice, those were my people. You choose the wrong people. You chose the wrong crowd. Those who are rich in faith were meek and humble and lowly, and I think this goes back to Jesus Christ again. Like, it's a very similar thing. We're supposed to be like Christ. We see a theme of Christ. Christ was despised and rejected. He was lowly. He was humble. He was spit upon. But it'll look a lot different when he returns in glory as King of Kings, won't it? It'll be a lot different when God says, look at what was despised in this world. I have exalted. I've taken what was last and made it first. You guys chose wrong if you chose from a worldly standpoint. If you chose all your friends from this way, that you're choosing all these people who are great in the world's eyes, these people who are fun. And he says, no, Christianity and faith is to see people, to see hurting, to see lowliness, and to gravitate, to go outside of your comfort zone, to reach out to those people who are God's people and his children. So as we look at this, James says in verse 6, he says, but you dishonor the poor. And he says, are not the rich the ones who oppress you and drag you into court? He says, are not rich people the ones who are giving you all of this trouble? And he says, are they not the ones who blaspheme the glorious name by which you have been called? He says, don't you realize that many times it's that exact culture who's attacking the Christian faith and trying to suppress it? That the people who are chasing after all that the world thinks is great are the exact people who are giving the Christians a hard time? But yet you have chosen to link arms in this world with the wrong crowd. And, you know, I'm not saying that there's not, you know, in closing today, a little bit of variability. I mean, of course, there are people who are maybe not poor, who are rich in faith. But as we're choosing and we're thinking in this world, we have to ask ourselves the big question. When we're trying to choose friends, are we choosing because of what we're going to get out of it? And what does that say about the depth and the core of our heart? Are we really choosing our friends and gravitating towards the people in that room who need friendship? Or are we choosing based off of us? At the end of the day, is it all about us? At the end of the day, did we invite someone who'd invite us in return? At the end of the day, did we discriminate without even realizing it? We thought, oh, we're a good friend, we're very friendly people. But did we make someone feel shut out who didn't have friends? You know, did we become judges of people with evil intents and thoughts? You know, and I think, you know, this is always going through, you know, once again, like I started off, it shows the heart of true faith, the heart of what's inside a real follower of Jesus Christ. Because when you have Jesus Christ in your heart, you're gonna change to see the world differently. You're going to look out and you're going to say, man, that person is hurting. They're in need. They need friendship. They need comfort. They need, and you're going to change your mind, as he talked in the beginning chapters, where he said, you know, if you pursued the things of this world, you pursued all the wrong things. You know, part of holding the faith is, who do you value in this world as friends? Is it someone that, is your group of friends all great friends? Or you got groups of friends that are difficult because you're trying to be a friend to people? You know, you're trying to be someone to someone who needs the love of Jesus. You're trying to be someone to people who need comfort. And it's very simple if you just think about it. Who did Jesus gravitate to in his ministry? He went to the crippled and the blind, the beggars, went to the people who are in sin and being lifted out. He went to the people who are hurting, you know? And that is part of the Christian faith. When we look at what is true faith, what is true Christianity, we need to examine our circle of friends. And we need to say, who am I reaching out to in my town, my community, and my church? All of these things. We need to examine, who am I valuing and who am I discriminating against? Because we may not realize it. I think many times we just don't realize it. But we need to have that view as Christians as we hold the faith in our Lord Jesus Christ. So let's close in prayer this morning. Our God and Father, I know it's so easy for us to drift off from vibrantly, or I would say like a motivated pursuit of you that is pursuing the things that you have, that so many times it's so easy for us to drift off into what is good for me in this life and what is beneficial for me in this life, and what friends are good for me in this life. But Lord, I pray that you just help us to hold to the faith, to hold to that path that just that sees people as important, that sees people as needing love and care and friendship, and that we are living for you, Lord, and not for us. And I just pray that you just help each person to be able to see in their own heart and their own lives, and to be able to see, am I really walking in the right walk? Am I really living in the right way? Am I really seeing as true faith would see and walk and live? And I just pray that you just make that clear to us in our choices and in our lifestyles, Lord. And I just pray this in your Son's name. Amen.
Let's be standing this morning. Shine, Jesus, shine.